All right. So you hear a lot of people these days, especially on the Christian nationalist side, talk a ton about how they should ban abortion, how it should never be allowed. It's a black and white issue for them. It's just, there's no nuance to it, basically. It's just basically all or nothing at all, in other words. So a few weeks ago, I came across an interesting article looking up how Christians handled it in the earlier days of the church, and that's what I'm going to share with you, the audience. So let's actually just get started here and start reading this thing, because I found it very fascinating, and it really does kind of just paint a much different picture than what a lot of these fake trads will present. So, abortion and contraception in the Middle Ages, both were far more common than you think. Today, conversations around abortion and modern Christianity tend to take as given the long-standing moral, religious, and legal prohibition of the practice. Stereotypes of medical knowledge in the ancient and medieval worlds sustain the misguided notion that abortive and contraceptive pharmaceuticals and surgeries could not have existed in the pre-modern past. This could not be further from the truth. While official legal and religious opinions condemn the practice, often citing the health of woman, a wealth of medical treatises produced by and for wealthy Christian women across the Middle Ages portray a radically different history, one in which women had a host of pharmaceutical contraceptives, various practices for inducing miscarriages, and surgical procedures for the termination of pregnancies. When it came to saving a woman's life, Christian physicians unhesitatingly recommended these procedures. So why is it that they could have a different view then, but now all of a sudden, everything has to change now? Like, it's funny how people in the modern age have to take the most extreme position on every single issue, as if there's like zero nuance on things. So anyways, let's keep going forward with this. Since antiquity, the termination of pregnancies has long been associated with women at the margins of society, such as sex workers, and highlighted not only for the termination of the fetus's life, but for the great danger it posed to women. For instance, in the Hippocratic Oath, Hippocrates refuses to assist and recommend euthanasia, and additionally refuses to give women abortifacients, given the danger to which they put on the life of the mother. Religiously, the Church Council of Ancria in 314 AD stated that women found to have committed or attempted an abortion on themselves or others were to be exiled from the church for 10 years, revising earlier suggestions that they be exiled for life. Yet in the mid-4th century, the church father Basil the Great revises these decrees, suggesting that time should not be prescriptive, but dependent on the repentance of the person. There, however, he focuses not just on the fetus, but again on the danger of these procedures for women who usually die from such attempts. And the thing about this is this is before the schism. This is pre-schism Christianity, and they're coming to these conclusions. The laws of the early Christian world generally reflected these prohibitions, outlining exile as the punishment for whomever has undertaken an abortion or aided in one, or death if the person dies in the process. And I apologize for the background noise. That's just my girlfriend cooking up for dinner. Anyways, many of these laws were codified in the 6th century Digest of Justinian, a legal compendium culled from the ancient legislative opinions. Nevertheless, these legal opinions betray the real complexity that abortions had in the ancient and medieval worlds. For example, the Digest cites the opinion that the jurist Tryphonius, where a woman was sentenced to death for undertaking an abortion, precisely because she did so with the malicious intent of denying her husband an heir by aborting the unborn inheritor. Legally, we see abortions being intimately associated with a patriarchal control of lineage and reproduction. The Digest clarifies that if a woman undertakes an abortion after a divorce, so as to avoid giving her son a husband who is now hateful, however, she should only be temporarily exiled. The 4th century church father John Chrysostom even turned these stereotypes on their head. Though criticizing abortions on one sermon, he offers the example of a sex worker forced to have an abortion so as not to lose her livelihood. While damning the act as a murderous practice, he places blame not on the woman, but on her client, chastising the man by saying that the sex worker cannot be criticized for seeking out an abortion, writing that, well, the shameless act is hers, the cause is yours. Thus, it is the sex worker's client who is the cause of the murder, not she who requires her attractive body to survive. And see, that is a position nobody in today's Christian sphere would ever have the balls to take. Nobody would ever take a position like that where they would say something like that. In fact, a lot of people would accuse John Chrysostom of being a liberal for having that kind of mindset, or they would say he's talking like a leftist. But really, like, let me ask you this. So do you think that's crazy? What do you think of that? That, like, John Chrysostom said that the client who had sex with the sex worker is more guilty than the woman who sold her body. What do you think of that?
I don't know.
It's crazy, isn't it? But
Yeah.
Nobody would take that position today, because today they would blame the woman. But like back then, they were blaming the man, not the woman.
Yeah.
Which is different.
Even now, they still blame the man.
Right. At some cases they do. But if you listen to a lot of these Christian nationalist types, they're always attacking women. That's like their main target of attack is usually women. But the crazy thing about this is John Chrysostom is not taking the same position that someone like Andrew Wilson would take. He's not taking the same position that somebody like a Matt Walsh would take, or any of these right-wingers. Despite the prohibition in the Hippocratic Oath, gynecological texts were replete with recipes for contraceptive and abortive suppositories. The 2nd century gynecology of Soranus of Ephesus details these recipes and advocates their use for women who have a medical reason to prevent pregnancy, strongly opposing their use simply because of adultery or out of consideration for youthful beauty. Given the health risk involved, thus adultery and conceited desire to preserve one's good looks were often lodged against women known to practice abortions. The recipes of Soranus were transmitted across the centuries in various texts, each demonstrating an active history of use and commentary. For example, in Aetius of Amida's 6th century medical treatise, the author details the use of contraceptive vaginal suppositories, elaborating on the improvements to the recipe of Soranus' time. There, Aetius writes that once contraceptives have been used, if she wishes, the woman may have intercourse with a man. It is infallible because of its many trials. Aetius' gynecological treatise has often been associated with the patronage of the elite imperial circle of the Empress Theodora in Constantinople, an empress whom the court historian Procopius once described as often conceiving by using almost all known techniques she could induce immediate miscarriage. The use and efficacy of contraceptives and abortifacients, that word is tricky, abortifacients extend throughout the Christian Middle Ages. In one 12th century text from Salerno, the author offers an example of sex workers who frequently have intercourse yet rarely conceive. Because back then they thought it was much better that if you were going to sell your body for money, that you are better off not having children. And a lot of people today, a lot of women that are in that practice today, take on pretty much the same position that a lot of them were doing back then. I mean, a lot of things just really don't change throughout history. But what does change is people's ability to honestly talk about it, which is really shameful because people tend to lie a lot more than they do tell the truth. Therefore, the medical historical evidence proposes a very different story from that told by official religious or legal texts. The fact of the matter is that good Christian women were indeed undertaking abortions and using contraceptives, yet the wealthy and elite Christian women had not only recourse to the best medical knowledge of their era, but also the privacy to undertake these practices without shame. See, and that's always a class issue. That's always a thing too. Like people of the upper classes are always going to be able to do actions that would be considered very immoral to people of lower social status. Most surprisingly, however, these medical practices were not only relegated to herbal pharmaceutical contraceptives and abortifacient drugs, but also the various surgical interventions, what today we would refer to as a late-term abortion. In the early 10th century, Life of the Patriarch Ignatius by Nicetas David Paphlagon, a narrative of a religious figure, the author recounts the story of a woman in labor with a breached birth. There she is in immense pain, and the author writes that in order to prevent the woman too from perishing with her child, the doctors attended to operate on the baby and draw it out by cutting it limb by limb. Well, the procedure ultimately does not need to happen thanks to the miraculous workings of a relic. The author, without any moralization or shame, details here the contemporaneous procedures for an embryotomy, as described in medieval surgical manuals. Further corroborating the continued use of the surgery, we can note that the 6th century text by Aetius of Amida, citing a certain Philomunius and Serranus, details the operation of the embryotomy. Sorry, I'm not great with these big words. They're all tongue twisters. Similarly, the same operation is also recounted perfectly in Paul of Aegine's own 7th century compendium on surgical practices. These late-term abortions echo their modern counterpart, demonstrating that this was a known and established practice in the Middle Ages. This medical knowledge flourished in particular in the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire, most commonly known today as the Byzantine Empire. Glimmers of the medical prowess of the Byzantine Empire and its long thriving histories are scattered across medieval sources. In fact, one of the first recorded use of a C-section on a living woman comes down to us from Visigothic Spain, but the text tells us the deed was performed by a skilled Greek, aka Byzantine doctor, who is called to save the life of a living mother whose child has died in the womb. While cesareans were used in antiquity, they were deployed then only to rescue a child from a dead mother. In the Lives of the Fathers of Merida, composed in the 630s, the author chronicles the life of Paul, Bishop of Merida, around 540 to 550. Paul is a Greek who is trained as a doctor in his youth. In order to save the life of a wealthy woman, he must put his clerical garments aside and sully his hands with the embryotomy. The text describes how, with the wondrous skill he made, was a most skillful incision by the cunning use of a knife, and extracted the already decaying body of the infant limb by limb, piece by piece, in order to save the woman's life. The only difference between the figure of the sex worker shamed for her abortions and the persons whom these gynecological and surgical books were commissioned is that the latter were courtly elites. Therefore, they had better recourse to medical knowledge, treatment, and privacy. But the fact of the stories of late-term abortions, even they find their way into saints' lives without judgment, belie a more important fact, that abortions were undertaken for the preservation of a woman's life or health, were rarely, if ever, under attack by medieval Christian authors. Oh, wow. So people today are stupider than people back then. Imagine that. Not even the moralizing religious texts touch upon such cases. This is a fact that modern Christian pundits have not merely forgotten, but just never learned, because they're freaking dishonest morons. That's why. So yeah, there's a history lesson for you guys that no one ever teaches you. So basically, all these liars on YouTube want to basically deceive you into thinking that this stuff never happened back then, because they're expecting you to just be ignorant enough not to pick up a book and read anything and do your own research. Well, hey, I'm back, and I'm here to tell you that fact is always going to be more interesting than fiction, because all these people that talk, all these talking heads, they're just telling you people fairy tales. That's all they're doing. They're just telling you people a bunch of fairy tales and lying to you. And me, I'm all about the transparency. I don't care about the lies. But anyways, I just wanted to do this short stream to teach this little history lesson. Hope everybody listening in learned something from it. Thank you. Till next time.